My name is Kate Charters and I'm the chair of SEGRA, which is the acronym for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. And SEGRA is really committed to advancing and advocating for the issues affecting regional, rural and remote Australia. And so it's been great to be able to offer this series during the lockdown period to continue to keep the issues that matter to us on the agenda. I'm delighted today to welcome Michael Campbell to talk to us. The style is very conversational, and so I really encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions of Michael. And we've had a couple of questions sent in earlier in the piece that we'll look at during the day. Michael will be very familiar to a lot of you. He's spoken a number of times at SEGRA and is certainly recognised throughout Australia for his skills in regional economic development. Michael's the director of Lucid Economics and has over 15 years experience across economics, property, economic development and tourism. Michael's experience spans 3 continents and includes significant time working with corporate management teams in regards to capital investments and site selection, as well as working with government at all levels to generate new jobs and investment through economic development and tourism. Throughout his career, Michael has advised corporate clients on over $1 billion of capital investment and located 54 corporate operations representing $425 million in capital expenditure and almost 4,000 new jobs. Over the last 7 years in Australia, Michael has provided a range of advice and analysis to both public and private sector clients. He has become a trusted advisor to many local and state governments in economic development, investment attraction, planning and tourism. Michael also provides valuable advice and analysis in some of Australia's largest property developers and investors. So welcome, Michael. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Thanks, Kate. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm new to the format, so should I just go? Fantastic. Look, I appreciate everybody taking some time out to have a bit of a conversation. I do think it's very timely, as we are starting to emerge in various parts of the country from the lockdowns and COVID. And I think when we start thinking about, the investment we need to be making in our communities as part of that recovery, we need to also start thinking about how this entire pandemic and how everything has actually changed the world that we live in, and not just around washing our hands and social distancing and a lot of the social aspects. But if we think about it from a business perspective, this has added a whole new layer of risk to everything every business has ever known. Whether it's a tourism business, a hotel, a cafe, a restaurant, a manufacturer, a transport, it doesn't matter. This is a whole new layer of risk now that people will start to consider, particularly when they're looking at new investments and depending on where those investments are potentially placed. You can appreciate it now as a hotel. Do you really want to sink $60 million into an asset that could be stranded overnight, earning you no revenue whatsoever? And so, it will fundamentally, I think, change how businesses think about their business, which on the one side is good. It will make them stronger, more resilient, to look at risk management better. But at the same time, I think it's going to trigger and make some investments, again, like a hotel, particularly in regional areas, a bit harder again to just get over the line, and it was already hard to get that over the line. So I think it does change the world in that sense, and we know, from looking at all the figures and the analysis and research that's coming out, certain industries have been hit a lot harder than others, and that means that certain regions have been hit a lot harder than others. So you can see from data that the ABS and ATO have been putting out, that tourism, accommodation, food services, retail, recreation, cultural services, they've been the industries that are harder hit. And so if a region has more exposure to tourism or to those industries, then they're also harder hit. Going around the country, you can see from some of the unemployment data in those areas that were very exposed to tourism, like a Cairns, unemployment's, 10%. Whereas other regions, maybe closer to capital cities or regions that just were a bit bigger, had a bit more diversity, that unemployment hit is closer to 5 or 6%. And so we see that sort of a difference, and that's important to how we're going to recover and emerge coming out of this. And hopefully, too, we can start to look at our economies and see, where do we have this risk? Where do we have different exposure? Where can we build diversity and resilience into our economies? So I think if we look at how the Commonwealth in particular has responded to this current crisis and risk, it's very interesting, particularly on the tails of the bushfire season that we had. And I do find it slightly curious that we stopped talking about bushfire a long time ago when COVID hit, and it's been sort of overshadowed by the bushfire crisis, has been overshadowed by this COVID one. But if we look at how the government responded to the bushfires and look at how they responded to COVID, it's a very different scenario. Those of you in bushfire affected areas would know the loan programs came out, the authority was announced, billions of dollars were announced, and those initial loan programs, they came with heaps of paperwork, that people were expected to fill in when they were still traumatized by the event. And so what they found, all these programs they came out with for the bushfire recovery in the first couple of weeks, no one was taking them up, because they just couldn't get through the paperwork, couldn't get through it. And so if we look at how they responded to COVID, quick, easy, fast, getting the cash flow booster, the job keeper payments, the loans from the banks that the government has underwritten, all of that happens very easily, very quickly. And I think that was a learning the government took on coming out of the bushfires. So I think that's something that's going to be maintained also as we move forward. And we're starting to see this emerge already in certain state grant programs. The state of WA has a regional economic development grant program that they deliver through the development commissions. And if you look at how that's currently being advertised and they're looking for grants, the application is wholly online. They want to know the jobs, and they want to know how quickly the jobs are going to come online. And it is about that response to COVID. And so that does make it about tourism and the recovery of tourism industry in regional WA. But it's a lot quicker, faster, more efficient way of delivering the money and the grants. And so those of us who've been on the journey and remember the Regional Development Australia Fund, however long ago it was, and how it transitioned to whatever it was, and then building better regions over this time period, the business cases have gotten thicker and thicker, and the governments wanted less and less risk. And so a lot of effort had to be put, a lot of time had to be put into preparing those things to make sure they could get through that risk assessment that the assessors put through. Now we're going to come back a bit, I think, and we do feel that the Commonwealth and the state governments will have various stimulus and recovery programs for all areas across the state. They're going to be targeted at infrastructure, and they're going to be targeted in areas to try to have the most immediate impact. And so the infrastructure is going to get the kick to the construction industry. That gets money flowing around the economy again, which is good, but it's also going to be targeting things like tourism, which on the one hand, again, was the sectors that was most hard hit, but is also one of those that has the ability to come back the quickest. And so we'll see that combination, I think, playing out as more and more grant programs are going to be announced. And we do think they are. Earlier this week, what was it, $250 million announced to support creative industries and the arts. And again, little detail, but that money is going to get out very, very quickly, we feel. And we can see, or foresee, I should say, other programs coming out for principally local governments to apply for, to spur on that recovery. And you're still going to have to provide evidence that's going to be creating jobs. You're still going to have to tick some of those boxes, as they say, in terms of that risk assessment. But by and large, it's not going to be, if you guys did an application for the BBRF round 3, you'll know the kind of volumes of stuff you had to put together with the architects and engineers and costs and CVAs and all the rest of it. I think we're not going to have that level of scrutiny anymore. It is going to be more about trying to spur on the recovery as we speak. And we're expecting, some state governments have come out with big infrastructure projects already, Victoria and Queensland in particular, and that's that money coming in. But there will be other programs. Once we can start to see, and we're real certain about that light at the end of the tunnel, I think that's when more of these programs are going to start to emerge. This recent flare-up around Melbourne is very unfortunate. But look, I think once we get past this, it'll be in that July, August sort of period, I think, when we'll start to see hopefully some further announcements about that that sort of stimulus. So I think by and large, we will see that stimulus coming. And me personally, I'm beginning to worry about how much this is going to cost all of us over the long term. There's going to have to be, I think, a COVID-19 levy put in place, and my children will probably be paying this off throughout their working careers as well. But it does strike me that my grandmother lived. She was a young girl during the Depression, and she lived through World War II. And I think this is one of those moments for our generation currently like the Depression and World War II was for her. So this is going to be one of those defining moments, and will have very lasting impacts, not just on us as a community, society, and human beings, but also on our economy, and in particular, how we need to be thinking about resilience and economic development, and what the government's role is in all of those things. So, Kate, I think with that, I'll sort of pause to see if there's any initial questions or topics that people want to jump into.
Yeah, Michael, just following on that, I wouldn't mind getting your thoughts on the impact of COVID, in the sense we've had a lot of different sort of sectors discussed in the last couple of months, and it seems everyone seems to agree that COVID seems to have just accelerated underlying weaknesses. It really hasn't created something new. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective and business case side of things, has there been anything there that COVID's really just accelerated or brought to the top that was already bubbling there as a weakness or an issue?
Well, I think, as you said, it does accentuate the those weak points already. You know, for example, if you're a region that's heavily reliant upon agriculture or mining or tourism, you're already exposed. And because this pandemic and the subsequent lockdown directly and immediately impacted, you know, the tourism industry, we see that exposure. You know, it'd be like up in Cairns in the when was it, about a decade ago, when they cut the Japanese flights, and all of a sudden, you know, a third, you know, 40% of the tourists to Cairns just weren't there. You know, so it just creates this massive hole. Now, imagine that in the context of the mining. Imagine, God forbid, that one day to the next, China quits buying our iron ore and our gas. You know, all those regions that rely on that are just, you know, they're going to have a very, very difficult time. And so I think it is one of those that it exposes and sheds the light on what we've known for years, and talking about sustainable economies, diversity, the importance of diversity, and not being reliant upon one sector. It just really exposes those sort of weaknesses. And I think the other point that we're seeing too, which we need to start thinking about for the future, is how this is also already, you know, it greatly accelerated a variety of trends that were already there. So we think about online shopping. You know, talking to Westfields and a lot of large retailers, they're thinking that from what they've experienced, there's been a leapfrog, an acceleration of 3 to 5 to 7 years of that trend for online retail. You know, so we need to be thinking about, well, how is that going to impact our community? How can we leverage that as a potential advantage? How can we build on that potentially? You know, same thing goes for remote working. And this is something I think that can have real opportunities for regional areas in this country, where all of a sudden now, you know, the need to have accessibility to get into Sydney, to get into Melbourne, to get into Brisbane, maybe we actually didn't need that so much. Maybe we can actually, you know, operate our business from somewhere we'd rather live, you know, as opposed to having to maintain that link to the capital cities in those areas. And again, that was a trend that was already emerging, and we do feel that that's going to be accelerated. There's some research that CBRE has done across Asia Pacific, where they interviewed and surveyed a lot of their corporate clients, and these are going to be large corporates, lots of commercial office space. 70% of those businesses said they're currently investing in and investigating ways to get more, you know, keep their staff at home, to keep their staff working at home. And I think that's really interesting in the context of the same survey found that not many of them at all were looking at using co-working centers, and only very few of them were looking at changing their actual office densities. So the amount of space they allocate per employee for the office. Now that's really important, because they're not worried about changing the density. And before, it was always trying to shrink it to save cost. They're going to maintain the density because of the social distancing that people have to do. But what they're going to do is actually see a net decline in their overall requirement for space. And while I don't think this is you know, spelled the end of the CBDs, you know, in the city at all, it's not going to be that extreme. But it does start to create this opportunity about working remotely, and I think that does certainly create opportunities where small businesses who, you know, might be on the periphery now, might be in the Blue Mountains now, and you know, so they have that access into the city, but they might go, geez, we could actually move out to the beach or the coast somewhere and move our whole business out there, because we just don't need that nexus to the capital city anymore. So I think a lot of these trends have been accelerated by this. And again, anytime you get a significant shock or time of pressure, it's going to go to the weakest link first, and that's what's going to break.
Yeah. You're on mute, Kate.
Thanks, Robert. We've got a question here from April, who notes that in local government, we're finding these quick COVID and bushfire stimulus programs, such as bushfire tourism recovery, are just making the programs where only local government can apply and then need to do the work with the community to find the projects and apply for multiple projects with many stakeholders. This shifts the administrative burden to local government. And we have another question that's also pointing this out, that there seems to be a shift to local government. Do you see this as a new trend?
I don't know if it's a new trend. I reckon it's been going on for a while. But I think it is curious what you're pointing out. And I think the Commonwealth in particular is always so quick. Their solution to any crisis is just throw some money at it and we'll sort of figure it out later. And so I think from the bushfire recovery side on the tourism, just very unfortunate that it was that quick shot reaction. The 10 grand they offered for people to get events up and running, where I find the 10 grand value very curious. They talked about how money was going to go to local communities and they decided, and then they gave most of the money to the state tourism agencies, but that's a whole nother thing. The fact is they're putting that burden on the local government to figure out what's best. And I think on the one hand, that does make sense. Local government is the closest to the community. It has that ability. But they seem to sort of come at it from this case of, we'll give you some money if you can give us a project. Where it'd be much better if we could have a longer term process where we know projects and areas and things where we need money, so that when these opportunities do emerge, we know exactly where we can channel some of that money into. If you go up to Townsville, I think they've always been very skilled at this, knowing that there's going to be a cyclone at some stage. And knowing that the government solution is going to be money, they always have 2 or 3 projects ready to go. The whole Esplanade up in Townsville was built on the back of a cyclone recovery, where the government shows up and says, "What do you need?" And they go, "Well, we happen to have this project right here." And they go, "Great, let's do that." So I think making sure we can plan in terms of local governments and knowing some of these areas, having a bit of a wish list, knowing where we could actually have some money or direct some money to have the greatest impact. But look, I do see the Commonwealth, and you see it at the state level as well, providing more and more responsibility to local governments without providing any ongoing funding to support that. So I think that's probably not a new trend. It's been going on for a while, I think.
Thanks, Michael. And the next questions come from Catherine. And she says, will working from home be inequitable for workers with young families and no appropriate office space? So is it shifting the problem backwards?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really interesting question, and also sort of the equality of this trend too, because we know older parts of the society also don't have access and capability to take advantage of some of these things. But I think in terms of the young families, I think if COVID's taught us one thing, it is about how we can deal with that. I remember being on a number of calls and having a young person run in here, on the screen while we're doing it. And so I think through COVID, we've all learned to appreciate those things. And so I don't see that younger families or workers with kids would be at a significant disadvantage. I think it just comes down to the productivity and, can you focus on the task at hand, be it a call or actually what you're trying to do for work, where, the kids are next door screaming at each other and one's about to, significantly hurt the other. I know my working day certainly had a number of disruptions while the children were here. So I think it's not necessarily an issue about an equitable sort of opportunity. It's more about how we as workers, transition our paths. And that's where, again, it accelerates another trend where we already started working non-standardized hours. And I think that's something that this whole process has just accelerated, where get up, get a couple hours done before the kids get up, a couple hours at night maybe. And so don't have the straight 8 or 9 hours during the day. It's broken up, into 3 or 4 different sections. And so I think those sorts of trends are also going to continue as more and more people continue to work from home.
Michael, I'm wondering, the impact on supply chains for regional Australia. You've raised that issue about risk, but I wonder, your thoughts about, they're talking about localization and that, what that might mean in the regional Australian context?
Absolutely. I mean, well, you can talk about it at a national context as well. Supply chains have been severely disrupted, mostly from what I can tell from factories in China shutting down as a result uh, of the pandemic over there. But of course, this just reverberates, through the entire supply chain, which is where it comes out to regional Australia. Again, accentuates some of those weaknesses that were already there. I know from the time I've spent up in the Northwest, if you get produce that doesn't have a bug and is not, pretty degraded, then you haven't really had your full experience, because of the miles that all that stuff has to travel. And I think, again, there remains lots of opportunities in regional areas where we can start bringing some of that production more locally. I know we're expecting some reshoring of different manufacturing operations. It's not going to be massive. Across each state, we're probably expecting a dozen projects will come as a result of this, because governments will underwrite the security in that supply chain, and it's predominantly going to be for health-related materials. The fact that we had to transition our distilleries to make hand sanitizer, I still find quite bizarre, but a great example of how people can be innovative in times of crisis to find new opportunities. So I think in terms of those supply chains, we're expecting some of that manufacturing to come back into Australia. That will be focused not predominantly around capital cities, but around those capital city regions. But I think for regional Australia, and again, something we should have been thinking about already, how can we get better, produce some more food locally, so that someone in Cairns, when they get a Bowen mango, it didn't have to travel to Brisbane and then all the way back up, and shorten those sort of miles that food has to travel. And the smaller your community is, the easier it is, I think, to actually do this. Because if you can get some of that local production up and running, and there's lots of good technology today to allow you to do that, whether it's through hydroponics or aquaponics or those sorts of things. The smaller the community is, the less of a threat you are to Coles and Woolies, and so they're not going to do anything. And again, you don't need a massive market to be able to actually get these things up in a financially sustainable manner. So I think there's lots of things that this has taught us in terms of how we can work on those supply chains, and not just around food, but around other products and services as well. And that some of that can be focused in those large regional centers, like a Townsville, an Orange or Bathurst, Geelong, those sorts of places as well. So it wouldn't just be in food either.
Yeah, with that approach then, if we're looking at that localization, and I'm just wondering the potential impact on business cases, because if you're raising the issue of resilience, we're probably looking at, and if we're doing localization, we're probably looking at a diversity of businesses, synergies in the business case, because obviously we're moving away from narrow supply chains. Do you think how that might affect, developing business cases or our thinking about getting a good business case?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we think about it in the context of a post-COVID world, whether you talk directly about supply chains or not, some of the arguments you're going to want to make, number one, the jobs that this is going to produce. Number two, the immediacy of these jobs, so we can show that the impact's going to be quick. But then you're going to want to be adding arguments talking about how said project helps build our resilience, helps build our local industry capability, helps build our ability to better react in a crisis. So start talking about all those sort of risk management things that COVID has made us look like, and building up the fact that said project not only ticks all of your boxes in terms of recovery and stuff, but helps make our region more sustainable over the long term, helps make our region more resilient over the long term as well. And some of that can be through diversification, from one industry or away from one industry to a broader base of industries. Or, if we are solely betrothed to the agriculture or tourism industry, how can we build some depth and breadth in that industry to diversify that industry? So, in that case of cans, we're not solely betrothed to the Japanese market, or in this case, again, the Chinese market. When they cut international travel, there was lots of businesses, that relied on Chinese visitors that just crumpled, from one day to the next. And so building that idea of resiliency through diversification and an ability to scale up and scale down, that's something else I think that this has taught us, that concept of a business scaling up and then hibernating. So how can different things actually provide you with that opportunity to scale up and scale down in a very quick fashion without doing, damage and harm in terms of laying people off and destroying value and destroying equity and those sorts of things. And so again, I think they're also just on the ground, there's going to be some new business models that emerge, from these types of crises. And that's where the regulatory framework at a state and Commonwealth level will also have to adapt and change, but that's over the next, 2 or 3 years probably.
Well, that seems, from what you're saying there's a real challenge in our thinking of putting these things together. Are we really up to it? Because you're talking about a fairly complex business case there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, a business case is always about, there's a problem. The problem's we're relying on the tourism industry. Okay, that's a problem. What are we going to do? How are we going to solve the problem? We want to invest into agriculture. Well, why agriculture? Well, we got really good land and we got lots of water, and historically we've always been an agricultural area. So, okay, well, that all makes sense. And then you start building the arguments on there. So, imagine it's a problem and you're trying to solve it. You're just trying to convince somebody that your solution's a really, really good one. In the terms of the funding, if you can show not only is it a really, really good solution, but guess what? Feds, I don't need that much money from you. I need a little bit of money, and I'm going to get a big bang for you over here. So now you're starting to pull at their strings in terms of, oh, that's good value for us. The minister gets to stand there in the picture and the ribbon cutting, and aren't we great? And, you keep ticking off all those sort of risk mitigation factors that they've built into this. But it's always around a problem, solving the problem, and providing some really good arguments on why that solution's a really good solution for that said problem. And yes, there's an infinite amount of complexities, that can go into all of these things. But again, just having that straightforward, simple logic, throughout a business case about those arguments and that messaging, that's never going to change, regardless of the amount of money you're going for or the program that you might be applying for.
We've got an interesting question here from Carol, Michael, and she was one of the people who earlier raised the matter of councils being expected to carry more and more of the burden. And she's particularly interested in when a state government identifies a particular region or city as a fringe city as a growth centre, and so there's a lot of new development, but she's saying that it's like a dog chasing his tail. Without new employment for the former rural jobs lost, new residents are commuting back to the major city for work. And I think that this is something that has been of concern to me in the decentralisation. Very often the decentralisation is creating dormitory suburbs, and it'll be interesting to see if people choose to work or avail themselves of working from home, if that makes any difference to those regions. But how might they go about looking at new employment options and bringing people into high-paid jobs in the region? Yeah,
and this is an issue we've been dealing with for 10, 15 years, really. We've done a lot of work with a variety of growth centers around the country, from all parts around Brisbane to Willandilly, Camden, around New South Wales and southeast of Melbourne, south of Perth, all these different areas. And just find this, it's always a bit perplexing for me, is that it's a simple sort of formula that the cities are getting bigger and bigger and they have to sort of accommodate more and more people. And so the government solution is creating these growth areas and just plowing out these neighborhoods. And as you said, we're not generating anywhere near enough jobs in those areas. And so we're sort of setting up our future fate to this, commute every day. And just look at southeast Melbourne and the changes there in 10 years. Used to be able to go from the airport of the CBD down to Narre Warren, if you guys know that neck of the woods, in about 40, 45 minutes. The last time I did that trip, it took me an hour and 40 minutes. And it was just because of the traffic. And so we're building all these sorts of issues. With that case in hand, though, it's actually interesting the reaction that we were already seeing pre-COVID. We were already seeing business people getting sick of that commute and saying, you know what, I'm going to forgo the big job in the city because I just don't want to do this anymore. And they start their own business closer to where they work from home. And we've seen this in places like Narrow Warren, in Armadale, in WA, in a lot of these different growth areas. And so I think in a post-COVID world, we're going to see actually, again, that sort of a trend accelerate, where I do think this buys us. It doesn't fix the problem at all. It just buys us a bit more time, where over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the congestion's not going to get as worse, as bad as it might have in a pre-COVID, type of a context, because a lot of the people we know driving into the city from these growth areas, they're taking up those office jobs, and some of them are middle managers, some of them are executive, but a lot of it is in that core sort of middle management and below. So your typical white collar worker, they're going to the growth area because of affordable housing and some of the amenity out there, and then committing to that commute for their job. Those are exactly the kind of workers that a lot of businesses will say, you know what, from now on, don't come in. Just stay at home. We'll do a weekly meeting in the office on Friday, because they're going to reduce their cost and their floor plates in the CBDs to save money. So I think, again, it's not a new sort of trend, and we are creating lots of problems for ourselves. We've done a lot of work around the socio and economic impacts of these growth centers when we don't have jobs. And not only is there some economic loss and leakage, but you see some real impacts to the community, because it means more time away from home. That means less volunteering, less spending time with the kids in terms of sports. A lot of those community organizations and the things that become the real heart of a community, they get negatively impacted by a lot of these trends. And so, in these areas, what we try to do is identify, well, where can we create meaningful employment that just is not a factor of the population growth, that can build real value into the economy and create some flow-on benefits where we're creating more local jobs. And we know not all those residents going into the city can take up those jobs, but at least we're starting to balance, that proportion of population growth and job growth out a bit. But we do see that there's going to be some acceleration of that trend. And while it's not going to solve the problem, as I said, I think we will get a reprieve, of a few years as a lot of corporates, start to shift their office holdings over the next, 1, 2, 3, and 5 years.
Michael, you're familiar with the project that Robert and I've been working on in an edge town to Toowoomba. And one of the things we've found there is getting an appetite, I suppose, for looking at what might be high-paying jobs that you might build into it, and building it in early on in its development. And that we've had to work very closely with business investors and entrepreneurs to even get that idea going. Otherwise, it's falling into a standard planning thing of more retail shops and services, which aren't always high paying jobs. Can you talk a bit about what might be the blockages to that sort of activity happening in these new growth areas?
Don't want to come down too hard on the planning institution in Australia, but I think we're all very well aware of a lot of the weaknesses in the system and the hurdles and burdens that it throws upon the economy for growth. But I think really what you're talking about, Kate, is it really comes down to a change of mindset and culture, both in terms of how we plan for these areas, but also most importantly, how businesses see a lot of these areas. If we harp on the Narrow Warren example from Victoria, I remember going with staff from our Melbourne office, out to Narrow Warren, which is how it was phrased, asking the guy, just tell me where to turn off. He goes, I've never been this far out of Melbourne, and it's 40 minutes. So I think part of it's also a social and a community change of perceptions about what these areas are and what they can be. And I think that the fun and exciting thing is that you can see examples like yours and others where we are trying different things and we are looking at new opportunities and new potential. And when some of these projects can get up, they start to create the trend and sets the stage and example of going, oh, you can do that now. Again, not to harp on the Narrow Warren example, but there's now 2 office buildings, standalone office buildings that are 10 stories. That would have been unheard of in a suburban sort of environment 5 and 10 years ago. But they've seen that sort of a change. And so, I think we can see these things change slowly over time, but it does take some innovation. It does take, some people being very brave. But you go to some of these areas, and there are those people. There are brave people that have some money, that are looking for the right investment, that are looking to do new and bold things. And so part of it is making sure we can identify those opportunities in our communities, particularly in these growth centers, but also and in any other regional center across the country. How can we identify this opportunity that's new and bold and exciting? And once we do that, how can we actually find the person who might want to take that on? And so in my mind, it becomes almost a simple sales process of having that product to sell. And I mean, in the context of economic development and regional development, it's hard to think about things as products. But when we're selling a community, that's a product. We're selling something. And then we got to find that market. And so it comes back to some of those standard, business marketing principles about how we're going to sell our product to the consumer that we want to buy it, which is going to be an investor or a business at some stage. You guys would have seen the report that Kim put out, earlier this week about the big movers from the regional, whatever they're called, about how this trend of millennials wanting to move actually out into regions as opposed to be into the cities. And I think this sets the stage and gives some evidence around something that we've seen happening for a while now, where we often get focused on a big company and a big investment, but oftentimes it doesn't need to be, nor should it be about that. It can be about small businesses. And two, having this millennial generation now that unfortunately I'm not in it, so it makes me feel older, but they're in their late 20s and 30s now. A lot of them have businesses, a lot of them have skills, and I think trying to appeal to those people in terms of saying, look at this opportunity we have. The article I read from the ABC was about a guy who was working in Sydney, Western Sydney, living with his parents, and he moved out and bought a house in Orange and thought it was the best thing in the world. He now has an 8-minute commute to work. So we can still, I think, really sell the lifestyle benefits of living in a regional area. And I think that millennial cohort, who are now in that professional age, now people that have businesses, small businesses, to really appeal to those senses, and particularly in this post-COVID-19 world, where being, a bit away from the capital city, which we know is the hotspot of these things, that can be a benefit, particularly if you're a millennial with a small family or thinking about a family. So I think a lot of these trends can work for us, but still comes back to finding that exciting idea, and trying to really promote the exciting idea in these areas and making sure the planners don't ruin it for everybody.
Yes.
Michael, following up on that notion of trends and just probably getting back to funding and financing your business case, there's been a trend for a while now that governments are wanting applicants to have more partners, private sector partners in the project. So, and particularly when we're looking at, say, place-based projects from local authorities, any advice on, or your experiences on how to actually find those partners that aren't, partners for nation-building infrastructure? But it seems to be a common question that when we come down to those smaller projects, place-based projects, have you seen any evidence of or ways applicants have sourced partners in those business cases?
I think there's lots of different ways. It happens a bit organically depending on what the project is. I think in the context of these grants and business cases, we also need to consider the government's position. So if you're in a bushfire affected area, I don't think you're going to be required to find partners. They're going to be looking, the authority of the fund was set up just to go. Now you do need to have your economic bushfire recovery plan, just like to access the drought affected communities right now from the feds, you need an adverse event plan, which is a new term they created, of course. So you do need to have those sort of things, but they're not going to recover that sort of co-funding. We get into more of the longer term, business cases. Again, they're just risk averse, so they don't want to be, the only money sort of in the game. So we think about Project A, and make it a tourism project, build on those sort of examples. It's just sort of like like anything. If we're going to go out and play golf, we're looking for people to go play golf with us. They got to like golf, so they got to want to play golf. And so if we have a project in that tourism space, who else would want to go play in that space with us? Is it going to be a state government? Is it going to be a local business? Is it going to be a local hotel investor? There's other parties there, but we just need to be thinking about it in terms of we're going out to play golf. We're going out to do something. Who else is going to want to play? and just thinking about that who else wants to play in terms of space of these projects, and based on the nature of what they are. If they're around agriculture, I think there's a lot of opportunity around the country in regional areas where we have so many small growers, and this old co-op model. I know it sort of died and it's got a bad name, but if we're talking about doing something bold in the agricultural space, let's go talk to a couple of the growers. Can we get them to combine and each of them chip in a little bit of money, that gets the pot bigger, and then that matches it. And then now they've parlayed and matched that money together with the government funding. So I think that, again, there's lots of different ways to think about how to work some of those financing, but it needs to start with, the idea needs to be a good one. It needs to be a sound one. We can't talk about putting, a casino in Long Reach. That's not going to work. So we're not going to get any excitement there. So that, these projects have to be valid and sound and grounded. But once you start getting those things, businesses will react to, oh, wait a minute, we can actually get in here and leverage government money. And so it's not all our capital going on, but we're going to receive a lot of the benefit. And so just be thinking about those ways, because the government does react very strongly where they see private sector involvement. So not just money from the local government. In the context of WA, you can get some money from Lotteries West, for projects. And over there, they'll go, okay, Lotteries is in, the Shire's in, okay, we can come in too. They really react very well to private sector money coming into those projects. And I would almost like to think we can get to a day where, projects and these things, they don't need the federal money, but the project's that good, the feds just come and be like, look, could you apply for this, please? Because we'd like to be a part of that. And we've seen that actually happen in terms of indigenous projects where things get going and the government's like, oh, this is great. Can we be a part? And then you could flip it on them, and then you could get them to apply to you, make them fill out a business case. Love to see that day. But look, I think it does come around that concept, thinking about it in terms of going to play golf or whatever you want to do, and who's going to want to come play with you.
Just going back to the RAI report, I suppose one of the things that I noted there was that the millennials, tended to move to larger regional centres rather than to what we would consider more rural and remote. There's only 17 cities in Australia with a population of over 35,000 outside the capital cities, and just to go back to this risk of dormitory suburbs or people in low-paid jobs working from home because it saves the business dollars. I think really tapping into your local area and their own values, which will be different from the government's values, which is to decentralise population, to come up with, as you've said, a good investable idea. And I think that challenges our thinking a bit, because we have lots of good ideas, but if they're not investable, then they're not likely to attract government support.
Yeah. I'd like to think the government has a policy of decentralization, but I think the government's policy is to make themselves look good.
Yeah. We've got a question here from Gordon saying, how do local governments feel about being approached from business with an economic development project? It's a good question, Gordon.
That often gets to be a tricky one sometimes. We've seen clients that that's so unthinkable, and the red alarms and flags go off about, we can't just deal with one person, this is too risky, oh my Lord, oh my Lord. And look, I appreciate that risk. Local governments are regulated authorities and need to abide by the rules set out within the Local Government Act in whatever state you may be. But at the same time, just because we're traditional organizations, just because we're very conservative and very risk averse, doesn't mean that we can't be innovative in the way that we think about our communities and moving forward. Most states now have brought forward a process of a market-led proposal in some sense of the word. And that's exactly that. Somebody comes and says, geez, that bit of land you got there, I can do something with that. And I really don't see a problem from that perspective of why local governments can't react and have processes in place to deal with those sorts of things. Now, it has to be a process. It has to be transparent. It has to be open, all of those sorts of things. But if the state governments can do it, and they're the ones that give us the Local Government Act, surely there's ways and means that local governments can as well. We have many clients that actually do that. They do it through typically an EOI process. And so again, it's all above board. But it's about sort of saying, we've got a piece of dirt here or this project there, and have that EOI. And I think too, there's certainly no harm whatsoever for a local government ever to talk to a business that wants to come and invest money and create jobs. But why shouldn't you talk to that person? Why shouldn't you hug them when you first meet them and go, thanks, this is a great idea. And there might be other ways too that you can help facilitate projects like that or investments like that without having, to use land or local government funds, as a part of it. And so I think we need to be embracing those ideas. And actually, too many times around this country, and we've seen it in lots of the communities we've worked in, you got a local person who's got a good idea for a business, and they come and they talk to council and go, here's what I'm thinking, I kind of want to do it. It might be a funky tourism thing or a cafe or a shop or who knows what. And the answer's like, oh, you can't do that. So you just shoot these people down immediately. So I think a big part of this is that as local governments, we need to be changing our mindset about these things. And look, I am pretty comfortable that we're seeing that trend happening, and we're seeing it happen because there's a lot of pain out there in some communities. And so councilors are being elected to deal with that pain. We have our populations declining, our economy is disintegrating. We need to do something. And so they're elected on a different basis. They then engage and hire executives to run the council who aren't, that conservative, who aren't that traditional, who will take a risk if they can see the reward. And we have councils doing that. Some very small councils, out in South Australia in Karoonda, very small town. They had a problem with childcare, and so council went in, bought a building, fitted it out, and started a childcare center, and they make some money on that. There's no problem with that. So again, innovative ways to react to problems that create jobs, that makes the community more sustainable, that brings community benefits that they want anyway. These are things we should be embracing as local government, whether the idea comes from a local business, a business from outside, or indeed a resident, or indeed somebody within council. And particularly in regional areas, and particularly the smaller that you are. And Kate goes to your point about the large centers. They're going to take care of themselves. And it's actually interesting. Bitter, the Commonwealth government, they came out with a study 7 years ago that showed that big regional cities were just going to get bigger because that's what they've been doing for many years. But the smaller the communities you are, the more at risk you are, the more innovative you're going to have to be to solve some of these problems. But what I've always experienced, interestingly enough, the smaller the community you get in, the easier it is to identify the opportunities. Because you can go around and say, what do you need here? And they're like, we really need a mechanic, baker, childcare, whatever those things are. They almost seem more readily apparent, the opportunities, as opposed to larger centers where you got to think a bit more about where's the real competitive advantage and the opportunity and the trends.
Yes, and I know Killarney has a large nursing home, but always struggles to get a doctor. And in the end, their local co-op built a medical practice and a house that was attractive to a professional family to live in. And so they now have a doctor, but they had to put that in. I know Albury's done a similar thing with medical specialists. They've got a building with a provision which they fitted out for medical specialists to travel to Albury and to use those facilities. That's a win-win for everyone. So yes, thanks very much. We've got time probably for a couple more questions if people have got them, but there's one that has been waiting for a little minute from Christine, saying that some basic tenets of, let's call it, neoliberal economic development theories need revising. Just a small observation. Are you specifically working on some deeper aspects of transitioning to other forms of economic development?
There's been a lot of debate in the United States, in particular through the International Economic Development Council, about some of these things. I think the whole idea of the neoliberal economics has failed and faltered. I'm not buying into that 100% because, there's a reason some of the traditional things are done, and it's because they work. But we do need to be thinking bigger and broader about some of the traditional tools. And the IEDC's produced papers that have shown, in the States, they've gotten into these investment incentives, and it's become very, very big business, and that they have worked to a certain extent, and that's its own debate. But what the IEDC showed was, if communities and local governments can just become a bit more broader in their sense and appreciation of business and growth and jobs and investment, start offering a variety of different services, that can make it easy for businesses to invest money, to get projects off the ground. What they found is that these non-financial incentives, these non-financial services, are just as valuable, if not more valuable, than these investment incentives. And so I think it does come back to the community and how the community wants to grow and have the community empowered. And the local government, state government, everyone's got a role in that too, but the local community also has a role. And I think for almost too long in this country, I remember when I first got here, it struck me as very bizarre. You go to a regional area and you talk to some business about what needs to happen, and the first thing to say is, oh, council should do this and council should do that and council needs to do this. I always was thinking, well, geez, what are you going to do? Their council's going to be very busy. And what we've seen in different parts of the country is where you can have a really collaborative business community, broader community that works together with the local government, and decides we're going to be the masters of our own fate. We're going to take on responsibility for doing A, B, and C, and you can take on responsibility for X, Y, and Z. And really having that collaborative approach to working with business, with the community, with the local government. Those are communities that tend to rise above and start to do, some really different and exciting things.
I might thanks, Michael. I might actually just throw this question to Robert and then back to Michael from Liz. Is there a model out there where the local community have collaborated with local government to diversify? So I'll throw to Robert and then you, Michael.
I know about a model. I know there's been various attempts at doing that, and it's a challenge, as Michael has said. But the model itself is really just the normal place-based approach to developing ideas that work well in a local location. And as Michael said early on, the future is about diversity and resilience. One of the barriers, of course, is exactly what Michael is saying too, that sometimes local government frameworks and structures are a bit backward looking. It's hard to innovate in a low risk environment. But Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, in terms of a model too, I don't know if there's a set thing, but what we can see examples, if you go to Narooma on the South Coast, the chamber's been very active. That they've engaged a lot with their own community, and they've actually also come to the recognition that we're not going to rely on the local government and the state government. We're going to be the directors of our own fate, and they've joined together with the Shire. And there's a number of projects that have come out from that. Some the chamber doing, some individual community members are actually running with, and then there's a role for the Shire as well. Liz, I think in your neck of the woods, you just may have too many groups. As we found recently together. And what we find in some of those areas is if we can start to bring people together, a bit more in that collaborative spirit, as we've spoken about, specifically for you guys, and how can we get those people working together a bit better? How can they leverage, some of the same services, so reducing their burden in terms of the community group or the chamber, the administrative burden, taking minutes, the bookkeeping, all of those sorts of things that sucks a lot of time away from people doing the things that they want to do, and having that. And, Liz, just imagine if you had one single chamber instead of the 28 different groups that might be out there. Interestingly, on the Sunshine Coast, something they did a few years ago, they had, I think, 14 different chambers of commerce all across the region, all in their own patch, all very parochial. And what they did is they brought them together under the banner of Sunshine Coast Business Chambers. And they created a mechanism for all those chambers to be able to have a direct input into council in terms of economic development and what was important in their patch. And then what were the commonalities across all those patches that they, as chambers, really wanted to see the council push forward with. It created a structure so that all of them could feed up and have a greater voice for their patch, into council, so they could actually progress a lot further. And it's worked really, really well for them. They still fight. You know, the people in Clounder still don't like the people in Maroochydore, and they don't like the people in Nambour, and Nambour doesn't like those people. But, you know, they found a way to work together, and it's based on the fact that they saw the value of it. You know, they saw the benefit of it for their local community. And I think that's at the heart of how we get a partnership to work. It's people to see that mutual value in working together.
Michael, there's one question I've got here, maybe to finish up with or get close to the end. It's following on your comments earlier about the, in relation to recovery projects, infrastructure, getting construction happening. I'm just wondering if there's a bit of a blind spot there, because at the same time we're saying the future is, you know, work where you love, the place is great. Creating jobs, in a sense, we've already got a paradox. We can't fill a lot of jobs in region areas because it's not a great place to live there. They don't feel good about it. So I'm just wondering, if we are going to roll out projects in the old thinking, are we just going to generate jobs but still not fill that gap of lifestyle, support, services to actually recruit people to those jobs? Because no one's really talking about that gap.
No, look, I think that's a great point, and there's a couple things around it. So, I mean, you're absolutely, construction jobs are what they are. The reason they're important is if we get 50 guys and girls working on Project X for 6 months, they're earning money, which they can then turn around and spend at the shops and the cafes and other parts of the local community. So that's where the construction thing becomes important. It's a short-term hit that can kind of re-inject the money. Now, to the you know, making the place better, I would agree, and this is where, you know, if you look at your community across regional Australia, if you're thinking about what can be done as part of that recovery, be thinking about those projects that can have that impact on place, like Robert's talking about. You know, so we get the construction sugar hit, but we also get the longer term benefit of making the place nicer, a nicer place to visit, a nicer place to live, increase that amenity so that we can be well positioned to try to attract those who may want to move out. You know, Kate, what you touched on in terms of the healthcare services, that's the number one issue. You know, and so is there a way we can bridge those gaps here? You know, I know Cranbrook out in WA, they did the same thing. They built brand new offices, essentially, you know, medical visiting rooms, you know, and stuff, and they were able to attract specialists and doctors because of it. So maybe there's some projects, you know, that can start to tick those boxes. But, you know, using this money that will be out there, I believe, you know, on those projects is important to get that construction hit for that benefit, but then also how that project can be benefited. And the great thing about tourism in this sense is we know tourism is not only a great way to sort of drive some economic outcomes, but it's also a great way to build amenity for the local community as well. You know, whether we're talking about a mountain biking park, you know, there's so many different projects that we can build that have that tourism element to drive economic gains, but also provide amenity at the end of the day for the community, and helps, Robert, as you say, build a greater sense of place, you know, and make it more attractive for people to move to.
Mm.
Well, unfortunately, Michael, we've run out of time. It happens to us every time. But thank you very much for your willingness to share of your great depth of knowledge in the area. I've found it a very enjoyable and interesting discussion. And we will be making the recording of this available to everybody early next week. So once again, Michael, thank you very much for bringing your depth of expertise to our session today. And thank you everyone else who's joined in the discussion.